Well, welcome everybody. I welcome you again to all of you that have joined us tonight. My name is Angie Ward, and I'll be facilitating tonight's meeting. I live in Olympia, Washington, and I am still working full-time outside of the end-of-life world, but am a hospice volunteer, have been trained as a death doula by Ashley Benham in Bellingham, and also sit on our state's funeral and cemetery board as the citizen member. So if any of you want to connect on any of those things, I'd love to. Our speaker tonight is Terry Skovronek. I see her up there. I give a little wave, Terry. Terry's bio is extensive. She's been doing this for a while. She is, I call her one of the mothers of the movement. She is an end-of-life specialist in many areas, certified crematory operator, home funeral educator, researcher, former board of director member for the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Philadelphia, National Home Funeral Alliance, National End-of-Life Doula Alliance. She also is the legislative monitor for the Green Burial Council for NHFA and for the Funeral Consumers Alliance. And in addition to all of that, she is an Orphan Wisdom Scholar, if any of you are familiar with Stephen Jenkinson and his Orphan Wisdom School. So we are really lucky to have Terry tonight to talk to us about family-directed funerals, business, or sacred honor. These events are really a treat for us. We've been looking forward to them and planning them for a while, and we just love hearing from our members, and seeing your faces tonight is just an extra special treat. We're so glad you could be here. We want to provide a little bit of background before we get started. Essentially, one of the cornerstone of all of this is at the National Home Funeral Alliance. We want everyone to know that home funerals are legal and safe. Our mission, as most of you know, at the NHFA is to empower families and communities to care for their own dead by providing educational opportunities and connections to resources that promote environmentally sound and culturally nurturing practices. On our website, you can find information about home funerals, including directories for where to find home funeral guides, home funeral education programs, home funeral-friendly funeral directors, celebrants and clergy, groups that will help families when needed, and my favorite thing, PowerPoints that you don't even have to make yourself for educating in your community. All of this and more is located on our website, homefuneralalliance.org. Just want to remind you tonight that the Home Funeral Alliance has no paid staff. We're a 100% volunteer-run organization, and we count on donations in order to be able to operate. If you are able to donate any amount, the donate button is at the upper right-hand corner of our homepage on our website. We know many of you have, and we appreciate it. For me, donating is kind of like that NPR situation where I give a little bit every month because I know that that's appreciated by organizations. So I do it just like I do all of my other donations, where I just give a few bucks a month to NHFA and know that it's distributed across the year. Tonight, as we mentioned, we're going to be focusing on family-directed funerals, family-directed home funerals, business or sacred honor. We're going to try to keep it to 60 to 75 minutes, providing some time for questions and answers and discussion during the last 15 or 20 minutes. So what's going to happen is Terry's probably going to speak around 35 minutes. We'll break it off into questions. Terry will manage those. And right at the 6 o'clock hour, I'll probably just remind us that we're at 6 o'clock so that those of you who need to get on your way can go. The recording will continue at that point. So if you need to go, please feel free. And you can always double back once we get this out there, these recorded sessions out there, which will be in the next, I'm not exactly sure, but in the next month or two, we'll have these available for people to view. So you can go if you need to, and if we continue past 6, then you can grab that at some other time. Just the reminder to keep your phones or computers on mute unless you're asking a question, and this will help the sound quality for everybody. And I'll turn it over to Terry.
Hi friends. Yeah, I'm gonna do that phone thing myself right now. There, I just did that. So thank you, Angie, and thank you, Kim. Well done, and here we are with our technology working, which is always a deeply pleasant surprise. And the first thing I'll say is, of course, I don't know the depth of knowledge that anyone here has. I mean, I recognize a few people. So an apology up front if I am either I've simplified things or I've gotten too complex. But here we go. So I'm going to share my screen right now. We're going to look at my PowerPoint. It's going to take me a second to get it up there. And can I get some feedback from you, Kim? Is that looking as it should? Beautiful. Okay. So falling into the conventional paradigm of today's manner of conducting interaction, I've chosen a binary headline. It is not necessarily actually the case. But so you see family-directed home funeral, business, or sacred honor, you know, and this is a topic that is hotly debated on some websites, and it can break along very emotional lines. And before we get into exactly what it takes to make any kind of a business out of any of this, let's take a look at what the fundamental controversy is around this. Well, the National Home Funeral Alliance and the people who were active early in bringing this matter forward had an objective, and the objective was to empower families and empower friends to care for their own loved ones. Of course, this is something that we've done for centuries, and for a very brief period of time, only about the last 150 years, have we forgotten this process. So the movement has been to re-educate folks about how to do it themselves. And folks who are antithetical to the idea of it being a money-making proposition will often point to, you know, that initial seed and remind folks, wait, this is about empowering families. Another frequently heard concern is that the home funeral movement should not be animated by profit-driven forces. And we know how quickly a financial motive can come to the fore and dominate a motive that's just founded on social justice. So it's not an illegitimate concern, you know, that people have when this matter of money gets brought up. People rightly point out that our energies need to go to protecting the existing rights that we have and to educate the public and institutions. And they're correct to point this out because, frankly, at any time, state by state, actions can be taken to limit our ability to care for our own dead. And if the focus and one's limited time and, you know, availability gets focused on development of a business, who's watching the boring stuff, you know, who's reading that legislation? Additionally, without educating the public and institutions, where's one going to find a client base? So there's great concern, right, that there's going to be too much leaning into the business end and not enough into the education. And then finally, the last concern is the goal of home funeral guides should never be to become another purveyor in the marketplace. We have that, and we have people who are very, very good at that. But if that were to ever become the dominating impulse within the home funeral movement, we lose the idea that this is supposed to be about empowering families. As sound as all those arguments are, take a look at the other side. Some people absolutely need and want help. They simply don't want to learn how to do it all themselves. And if there is no fee for help, then we're really undervaluing the labor of women. And of course, there are some men on this call, but this work is far and away taken up by women. So we get into a really sort of dicey economic equality matter if we take a staunch position that home funeral guide work should never be paid. I mean, really, we're talking about who's available to do this work. People of a certain volunteer work, people of a certain economic class, and mostly women. So to argue that no money should change hands really opens up some concerns about, as you see at the bottom, class, economic equality, race, right? Because we know women of color make 60 cents to the dollar, and Latinas and Asian women make 40 cents, actually 47 cents to the dollar. So if we're talking about who's got the leisure time and who's got the ability to volunteer, we're talking about white middle-class women. We're shutting out a lot of folks when we do that. Right? Well, the role of the home funeral guide, even when you want to launch into a business realm, is to educate, not to do for someone. And there are two primary reasons for that. One is the item marked here, that the hands-on work is what is most meaningful and therapeutic to families. And the second reason harkens back to the very beginning of this, that it is the movement, the fundamental right to care for our own dead. And when a home funeral guide moves in too aggressively and postures as a funeral director, she can accidentally take away the family's autonomy. Now remember, sometimes the family wants somebody to behave in a funeral director manner. But the expectation here, and my experience is, that is the less frequent event. So replacing a funeral director with a hired home funeral guide is neither the point of a family-directed funeral, nor is it legal. So if you are moved to care directly for the dead, hands-on work with the dead, your work must be in the form of a gift to families and not a fee for service. Now let's take a look. This is the best part. And you really cannot talk about making a business out of this without delving into the law. So we start with the notion of why can't I charge to help somebody take care of their dead mother? Well, because taking care of dead people is what funeral directors do. And funeral directing is what is known as a regulated occupation. Each state decides which jobs require a license. States set their own standards for licensing. They'll collect fees. They'll determine frequency of reapplication. They determine what you need to acquire a license, 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, 2 years of apprenticeship, and passing of a test. These regulated occupations are also subject to boards, just like Angie was talking about. And the board will issue you your license. It will revoke your license if they find that you have broken the rules of your licensure. I'll give you a few examples. You can read them right there. It might help you understand about these regulated occupations. Barbers, cosmetologists. I always think of CPAs, frankly, it's the one on the corner. Architects, funeral directors. These are all licensed occupations. And how this affects us is, again, let's draw from examples we know from everyday life. I can cut my kid's hair, but I can't put a sign out on the sidewalk saying Terry's Salon and take money from people to cut their hair. I can do my own taxes, but I can't charge other people to do their taxes because it is a regulated, licensed profession. And we'll end with the back to the funeral director thing. You can help someone care for their dead loved one, but you can't get paid for it if you're not licensed. So when one chooses to engage in home funeral guide work for money, you have to be very cautious about what service you're actually charging for. It can't fall into that category of tasks that belong to the regulated license holder. So what can you charge for? In that, every state manages their own terms and conditions of licensure. The definition of what a funeral director is different for every state. But there are some generalities I can speak to here. You can always charge for teaching someone. And the kinds of things that you can teach, I call it the washcloth demonstration. And I don't mean to be, short about that, but that's something folks will absolutely figure out on their own if you were to let them go. They'd figure out how to wash that body. But people really like to have a bit of confidence given to them. They've never touched a dead body before. By all means, people make demonstrations and they charge for it. Public presentations about family-directed funerals. That's another thing that people often bring to in-service environments. I teach at some community colleges and some adult ed schools, some adult ed programs. And the hardest part about that is getting in the door and getting through to that one person who answers the phone or that one person who reads your document. They see the word death and that's it. They're done. You can also charge for consulting services as permitted by your state. And I'm going to give you some good examples here. So some things, I'm in Pennsylvania and we have very, very generous laws here. So I could charge somebody for a consultation about natural death care. We can sit together and we can help plan the details of a home vigil. I can charge them for a Skype session or a phone coaching during a home funeral. And honestly, that's most of what I do. Most people do this on their own. They just need a little help on the phone. But let me go back to this caveat: consulting services as permitted by your state. Okay, so I really want to share this. This is fun. So here's an example of where one must be very cautious. And we could play a game, guess the state, but maybe we're not going to do that. So in this particular state, the following is something only someone with a license can do for money. And if you do it for money, you'll be in violation in that state. If you meet with the public to select or form an observance, like memorial service, you have just engaged illegally in funeral directing without a license. Here's another example. You're not allowed to arrange for the removal of a dead body. That's something I do all the time. All the time. Home funerals aren't that frequent. When I have a home funeral, I arrange for the removal. But in this particular state, that's not something you're allowed to do. Some of these get pretty absurd. You're not even allowed to arrange for a memorial service in this particular state. That's only the actions. You can't get paid to arrange it. Those who can get paid have to have a funeral license. Something else you can charge for are celebrant services in most states. Concierge services is something else you can charge for. I like these. There's a lot of leeway here and a lot of people want this. This is things like taking them shopping, actually just driving the car and bringing them to different environments where they can compare funeral products. Believe it or not, getting on the phone and managing when different family members are coming in from out of town and who needs to be picked up at the airport, arranging for flowers, arranging for food. Some of those things are going to be elements you cannot charge for depending on your state laws. But you can charge for, well, it gets a little dicey. In some environments, you can charge for your time. So you're not actually charging for having done the act. You are just renting yourself out. And finally, something else you can charge for are funeral goods. This is essential oils, alternative containers, caskets, shrouds. However, and this is the only environment where we encounter federal regulations, if you sell funeral goods and you are, well, if you're selling funeral goods, you actually have to follow a federally developed regulation known as the funeral rule. It was developed by the Federal Trade Commission because of some really serious unscrupulous activity by the funeral industry. So if you sell funeral goods, you have to provide a certain document in a certain format that contains certain text, and it informs the client about what your products are and what your prices are. You know, because there were things like bait and switch and hiding the truth, and a lot of subterfuge was going on. It's not a hard thing to follow, but it's serious. And even our good friends at the Funeral Consumers Alliance would drum their fingers and take issue with the Home Funeral Guide, who sold funeral goods without providing these general price lists and casket price lists. It's a very important thing. Now, luckily, it's very easy to abide by the guidelines established by that funeral rule, and it's all here. This book will be referenced again. We'll have it's all available on Amazon, and a lot of the data I'm going over tonight is from that page. Let's move on. Move on quickly. So details on that funeral rule. If you definitely are interested in forming a business that helps people care for their own dead, you can avoid being obligated to this federal law by simply not selling funeral goods. And by the way, I don't mean selling them at a profit. I mean, even being a middleman. Just avoid selling these funeral goods, and the federal funeral law will not apply to you. So I'm going to emphasize again that each state operates unto itself, and there is that one federal regulation. So each state makes its own regulations and statutes regarding everything having to do with death care and disposition, funeral services, embalming, things like bringing a body in state, out of state, and that federal government regulation is the only one that exists it's the only regulation on a national level. So things to consider if you're trying to actually make a living at this. And by the way, I must say, without a funeral director's license, I don't know anybody who makes a living as a home funeral guide. Even some of the names we might know and some of the folks who've been doing this for 20 years generate income through other means, primarily education. Actually providing that service of caring for the dead is not their biggest form of income. So it's absolutely imperative that you know your state's laws. There are several places where you will go to look for these things. Number one, you can always communicate with me. It's my favorite thing. The legal minutia is what I absolutely adore, because it's like those booby traps in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Everything seems to be going fine. And, you know, if you step in the wrong trap, you're going to run afoul. And we've yet to actually see how a regulatory board interacts with somebody who violates the terms of licensure. But we do have a case in progress right now. And this home funeral guide has her attorney, and it's costing her time and money. And, you know, especially if you want to run a business, you're really obligated to get it right. The places I'd go to look for information are your Occupational Regulatory Board. That's the entity that's going to design all the terms and conditions of licensure. Vital statistics is another arena you'll have to get to know. That's the place that's going to manage a part of the filing of the death certificate and possibly the issuance of the burial and transit permit. The Board of Health may have an opinion on things. Here in Pennsylvania, there's only one element to do with death that falls under the Board of Health. Everything else falls under that Occupational Regulatory Board. And I'm not subject to that board because I don't have a license. In some states like Maryland, for example, if you go to their website, the Attorney General of Maryland has an extensive contribution for people when it comes to advanced directives, designated agent paperwork. Not all attorney generals do that. Maryland does. The other entity you're going to have to seek out and get to know how they work, if you want to help people care for their own dead, is the local registrar. In some cases, it's your town clerk. They go by different names in different places. Every time you encounter one of these employees, there's that period of shock and mystification on their part. They've never heard of this before. They don't know why you're calling. They don't understand what you're telling them. They've only ever dealt with funeral directors. It takes generosity on your part and persistence. You need to learn the language of your state. Every state uses slightly different terminology, and if you're using an out-of-state bit of lingo, you're not going to, it takes a little bit of footwork. And this is the kind of thing that you are morally responsible for getting a grasp on, right, before you attempt to launch a business. The other thing that I just can't stress how important this is, the designated agent form. And I have a funny story about this. The designated agent form is a document that says who actually gets to make the decisions about the funeral. Now, every state has a chain of next of kin, custody and control. It's usually spouse, and then it'll be adult children, and then it will be no adult children, then it's parents. None of those two classes, now it'll be siblings. And in most cases, the majority of any one of those classes has to come to agreement on something. But you know what you can do? You can fill out a designated agent form and say, I want, and you name exactly who you want to be in charge of the decisions of your disposition. And that's the person that you as a home funeral guide will want to deal with. And on one of my very early occasions, I invested a tremendous amount of time with an individual. And I probably went to the house 3 times, did all the interviews, found out what all the needs and wants and desires were, and then found out, oh my gosh, this guy isn't the boss. He's not the one with legal custody and control, right? I just didn't know. That's the first question to ask. Do you have legal custody and control? If yes, by what means? And is there a designated agent out there somewhere? Now, interestingly, the other question I would ask right away is the location and the size of the deceased, because as someone without access to professional equipment and a large team, I had a lovely gentleman who really wanted a home funeral for his mom, but his mom was 300 pounds and his mom was upstairs. And that was nothing that we were going to be able to contend with. And in fact, they had to engage in some we were able to give her a nice funeral at home, but we were not able to execute the disposition. You need your disclaimer and your waiver. Those things are also in this book that I'm referring to. It's available on Amazon.com, and it's an NHFA publication. And I'm not just trying to market NHFA stuff. It's really it's a quality publication, and it has just about everything you need to know in it. The GPL, that's that general price list, and the CPL, that's the casket price list. The other thing that I have found over time to be critical is an agreement of selected services where everything is exquisitely and finely iterated, so there's no room for misunderstanding. And God, the least sexy subject on the planet, insurance, general liability, and umbrella. You know what? I can't say another word about it. I'll fall asleep standing up. That's my feeling about insurance. All of this material is unpacked more deeply in the book that I referred to a minute ago. Oh, look, what do you know? Here's a picture of it. And you can see that a lot of the contents that I've gone through tonight is from this book. Shout out to a former NHFA president, Lee Webster, who put this together with a lot of other people. She did some writing and she did a lot of compiling, and other folks did the formatting, and it was a lot of good work, and a lot of hands went into this. I'm going to stop that screen share right now, and I'm a little self-conscious that I really ran through things quickly, but it looks like I'm right on time. I have to tell you, it is almost ludicrous to attempt to go through the social, ethical matters of forming a business and then talk about business in 35 minutes. I mean, it's just crazy. So I guess now is the time when we open it up for questions. Is that correct, my co-facilitators here?
Yeah, so if people have questions, you can, if you're more comfortable typing them into the chat box, you just click on that chat box on the bottom of the screen there, or we can unmute you, right, Kim?
Yes.
And I'll say one other thing, I'm actually, I have no idea. Maybe everybody here has already cared for their own dead. I have no idea. Or maybe only 4 of us have. I just don't know. But it's really easy to do. They're dead. Right? To be blunt about it, you kind of can't screw it up, especially when you are operating from a place of absolute love and respect, and you get that overwhelming feeling of awe and beauty when you're with a body for several days, and you actually see the change that it takes over a 3-day period of time, and a dullness comes to it, but it's a beautiful dullness, but it's a dullness that reflects the departure of life energy. And if a family has cared for a dying loved one at home, I'm thinking, a hospice situation, those are families that have been dealing with, in some cases, feeding tubes. They've been managing the toileting and the diapers. They've been administering medication. They've been probably pulling phlegm, mucus. This is definitely a population capable of bathing, dressing, and lovingly caring for their own dead. And as a home funeral guide, you really don't want to submarine their lead, whether you're doing it as a volunteer or as a business. Holding back is better than moving forward too quickly. I'm sorry, I thought of something else. You may have noticed that there are a number of training programs that are out there. And this speaks to the very first slide or the second slide, about make a business or volunteer, make a business or volunteer. If I had to guess, I think there are probably more trainings going on a month than there are free public events educating communities or working toward community building. And I think that speaks to the passion that so many of us have about really wanting to be involved in this work, and we want to be hands-on. But boy, oh boy, that community outreach part and that educating the public part is deeply, deeply important. And I would ask of anybody who goes forward to create a business to tithe, essentially 10% of your time, 10% of your marketing budget to freely educating the public. All right, so I'm going to zip it.
Okay. Karen, looks like you have a question.
I do. And Terry, I know that the focus of this talk is on making a career of being a home funeral guide. But I am just curious about your opinion about becoming a licensed funeral director and whether or not that makes sense as an avenue to, to have a license to be able to assist people in, in this work. And I'm just curious what your opinion is on that avenue for helping people.
Sure, I'll say a little bit about that, and I'm going to see if Lucinda Herring is going to be willing to make a comment on that. Lucinda was very active from the home funeral piece, and then did get, am I right? If you are a licensed funeral director now.
Okay.
But I once you are licensed,
Yeah.
you are subject to a very different set of rules.
Yeah.
Than you are when you are unlicensed. And there are some things that you actually, in some states, won't be able to do because you're licensed, that you would be able to do unlicensed.
Yeah.
Right? Because of the regulations. Additionally, a funeral director's license is just like a realtor's license. You may have a license to practice real estate, but you have to be under the employ of somebody with a larger, a license with more gravitas. You have to be employed by a real estate broker. Same thing in there might be one state where this isn't the case that I can think of, but just as a licensed funeral director, you're not footloose and fancy free. The phrase is your license has to hang in a funeral home, and a licensed funeral home. Now that's a regulated entity, and that has all sorts of standards. So it might or might not get you to where you want to go.
Yeah.
Lucinda, you're muted there. Now you're unmuted. Would you speak to that, please? Lucinda lives in Olympia, Washington. Is that right?
No, would be. Can you hear me?
No, I lost you.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
Because I'm on an island. Can't hear me? Okay. You can hear.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So what you've just said, Terry, is all correct. Worked for 6 years with Shara Barrett at A Sacred Moment. We helped. Can't hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so I'll keep going. Sorry. So I worked with Shara Barrett at A Sacred Moment in Everett, Washington. Funerals and green burials. And Shara was the first president of the NHFA. So I was really lucky and able to get my funerals director's license in a funeral home that was supporting home funerals already. One, because I could work with Shar, but the other was I actually felt that it gave me more credibility working with the funeral industry to have a license, but also be working as a home funeral guide.
Yeah.
I found that to be true. And I found that families often will feel a great sense of relief working with me because I have my license as well as my home funeral training. I no longer work though with Shar, and Terry's exactly right. I naively thought when I got my license that I could be kind of a traveling funeral director, right? Licensed funeral director. Mm-hmm. You can't. You have to be associated with a funeral home. You have to have your license hanging on the funeral home wall. You have to be employed with that funeral home. And so like now I'm no longer working at A Sacred Moment. And so I can't work as a business as a licensed funeral director. I've gone back.
Wow.
Guide and consultant and educator.
Equally, it's worth remembering, because these licenses are issued state by state, there are a few that have reciprocity. Neighboring states might let you in, under certain terms and conditions. But you are once licensed. If you want to remain as an employed funeral director, you have to stay in that state. And the requirements are, I see this moving up continually, a 4-year undergraduate degree and then 2 years of apprenticeship, which is, it's really crazy. It's a crazy requirement for a funeral director. It's entirely unreasonable, but the objective is to, frankly, you know what? I don't need to, never mind.
So Terry, we had one other question come in on the chat. Before we get to you, Penny, I see your hand is raised from Rachel. Are Are there any, it kind of, and it goes hand in hand, I think, with what we're talking about. I just want to make sure we've answered it because I've been a little distracted here. Are there any licensed funeral directors who are facilitating home funerals in their funeral homes?
Sure. Sure.
And Danny also chimed in. I don't know if we want to unmute Danny. He says, I am a funeral director. We are facilitating home funerals.
Yeah. And maybe if we want to hear from Danny, you can unmute him in a minute. Funeral directors will do that to different ends and by different definitions, right? Caitlin Doty, right? She's a well-known figure in the movement. She's actually got a space where families can bring in their loved ones and care for them themselves. In my neighborhood, we have a funeral director who participates in home funerals, but his definition of it is very different than ours. He takes the body to his facility, he embalms it, he caskets it, does full cosmetics, does eye caps, jaw wire, and then puts the body in a hearse and brings it home to your living room, and you have a viewing in your living room. And that's a home funeral, but that's certainly not what we typically mean when we say that. Generally, we mean an unembalmed, unadulterated body, no vaginal plugs, that kind of thing. So Danny, I don't see where this man Danny is on my, Danny J. Flynn. Did you want to say a word about that, dear, as a funeral director? Hon, your audio's no good. We're not getting your audio.
We can barely hear you.
Yeah, shall we just move on?
Yeah, sorry, Danny. If you want to type something else in, that would be great.
You guys, I've got so much information. My gosh, you can, I don't know where people, find me. I don't know where, I should share that screen with my address on it again. See that at the bottom, dyingschool@gmail.com. I have so much information, and I can't wait to share it. So everybody's free to communicate with me. Anybody else?
Yeah, so we got Penny. Do we have her unmuted, Kim?
Yeah, great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So my question is, this is all right up my alley, and leading in, I was going to ask if there were people who worked with people in the industry as well. Where I live in Quebec, it's practically impossible to do home funerals. It is, there's only a 24-hour window after someone has died and between when they need to be legally embalmed. So unless things move very fast and the person dies at home and has a directive and all the family can gather, the body legally becomes property of the state. And unless they are in a sealed casket, embalming is legally mandatory. So my question is, it's very hard to work around home funerals here. And I wanted to know if there are states where the laws are particularly hard and challenging, and how people function within them, if there are things they can do to circumnavigate difficult legislation, if people have had luck lobbying against it. I'm just looking for people that are also in very difficult situations, and maybe people I can strategize with.
Yes, we have 8 states in the United States that have some requirement, either a minor requirement or a completely overbearing and onerous requirement that a funeral director be involved. We joke and say there is no such thing as the funeral police. Frankly, if you've got an anticipated death at home, someone's on hospice, just don't pick up the phone. It's another thing we coach people with. Death is not an emergency. It is not an emergency. The emergency's over. And there is no reason to immediately dial hospice. and start that clock. Now, I'm a little curious about that 24-hour thing, because it presumes, like what's the start of time? When the hospice doc gets there and calls it, in which case, again, you just wait a little bit. But that scenario only works with an anticipated hospice death at home, right? That's tough. That's a tough one. And yes, we have had luck fighting and changing legislation in the United States. Sometimes it's been as easy as just a whole bunch of phone calls and a good 30-day internet campaign against somebody who is going to bring a bill forward that contains limitations. And other cases, it's required. We've been lucky, well, other people have been lucky enough to get an entity known as the Institute of Justice. Think ACLU, it's like that.
Mm-hmm.
Argue about the illegality of some of the funeral regulation. So cooling doesn't count. It actually has to be embalming. Yeah, I don't have much to say about the where are you again? And is it your whole province?
Yeah, I'm in Montreal, but it's the whole province of Quebec.
Wow.
It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know about the rate? Yeah. Do you work in the field in death care?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Do you have a personal interest do you have somebody in your life dying right now?
No, I don't. I have done the contemplative end of life care course offered in Toronto. I did that about a year ago. So I've had a certain amount of training, and I help people as a community resource, but I'm not employed in that field.
I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
No, it's okay. It's a tough situation. I was just looking for places to point my compass.
Dan might be back. Let's try you again, Dan, see if we can hear you.
I'm here.
Hi, Dan. We got you this time.
Okay, sorry. Family walked in to pick up the ashes right as you called on me. So it's kind of like leap across the room.
What state, before you go on, what state are you in, dear?
California.
Oh, California. That's right. You held up the sign. Thank you.
Yes, the Republic of California. As far as the 24-hour thing, let me just address that real quick. By the way, I am a licensed funeral director in Santa Barbara, California. And we actually refer to ourselves as the anti-funeral home. All we do is direct cremations, green burials, and home funerals. We don't offer embalming. We don't offer casketing other than environmentally friendly caskets. But the 24-hour rule, at least here in California, only applies to licensed funeral directors.
Yeah.
In other words, that 24-hour clock doesn't start ticking until the moment I make contact with the body. A family doesn't have to follow any of those rules whatsoever. I always enjoy in the middle of the night getting calls from hospice nurses saying, I just declared Mrs. Such and Such dead and the family wants to keep her overnight. They're not allowed to do that, are they? And it's like, well, yeah, of course they are. They can keep the body as long as they want to. After about 5 days, they're not going to want to. But the 24-hour rule, again, at least here in California, the clock doesn't start ticking until a licensed funeral director has made contact with the body. So now when we work with people with home funerals and things like that, we have, the tech ice, what we refer to as ice blankets, to help cool the body as best we can for the family. And we have that wonderful formula from the Home Funeral Association about rotating the ice blankets for the first so many days and that sort of thing, which we found very helpful. But it kind of goes to that, we're not there to take over, we're there to help the family facilitate. Or we're there to help facilitate, to help the family help themselves, however you want to put that.
Wonderful, wonderful.
There's one of our other participants here, Jillian Rogers, just came on board with us. She is going to be our green burial and home funeral specialist. She's wonderful.
Beautiful. Where's Jillian? Wave your hand. Are you on the phone?
She's on there somewhere.
Oh,
I've been texting her privately saying, aim your
get on
camera.
this call. Anybody else?
Yeah, Terry, we've got one more question in the chat.
Great.
And we are getting down there. We've got about 6 minutes, so I'll just be checking in, being a little bit more vocal here to see what we want to do, if we want to keep going or not. But the question from Tanya is, what is the typical average per hour or per consultant rate for home funeral guides?
Well, you know, that's regionally driven, absolutely regionally driven. I was at an event 2 weeks ago, and these were death doulas, not home funeral guides. And a death doula in Manhattan was $185 an hour with a 2-hour minimum. You know, utterly insane price where I am in Philadelphia. So that's kind of a tough one to call. And you know, it depends exactly what you're consulting for. You know, are you trying to help them choose their, are you bringing specialized knowledge to them? Or is your consultation about, gee, should we choose a memorial service, an actual funeral, and where should we get the flowers from? That doesn't take specialized knowledge, right? That's an opinion-driven thing with a little bit of wise consumer behavior, making some phone calls, picking up some price lists. But if somebody wants to keep a body at home for 3 days and they want their death certificate managed and they want to perform their own transport, and you have to manage a B&T and make a reservation at the crematory, that's also a different rate, because now you're talking about some specialized knowledge. So, you know, where you know, I'm not a shark. I don't charge. I know some people who would answer that question at $85 an hour, no problem, you know, and then I know CNAs, right? Certified nursing assistants, who would beat all of our pants off taking care of a dead body, right? If they've worked in a nursing home. And the CNA can't make more than $12 an hour. You know, they're one of the lowest paid healthcare providers in the world. And they know it all if they've come from a nursing home environment. So, you know, I don't know. I can't tell you.
Tanya, do you have an additional question? I just saw that your hand was up, or was that it for you? She unmuted, Kim. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
we can. Go ahead, Tanya. Then we'll get to you, Dan.
I was just going to say that I'm in Colorado and I intend to be doing death doula work as well, and imagine that through the death doula process, a lot of the home funeral talk will come up, especially if the person is already at home dying in home hospice. So I imagine that anything that I would be charging, so to speak, would already be rolled into the death doula piece, because it will be covered along the way. But thank you for some of the insight into the range that you're dealing with if you are planning to charge based on what you're actually talking to or consulting with the family on.
Right. A couple of comments. You're in Colorado. You have some very special conditions in Colorado, conditions that don't exist anywhere else in the United States, and that are to your advantage. Number two, you know, the matter of the death doula, you know, there's a piece about the death doula that has, that's worth exploring a little bit, and that is that there isn't a lot of, what's the word, when you actually do patient care, when you are studying something clinical, there's not a lot of clinical time. So sometimes, you know, I have 2 different death doula certs. Neither of them required clinical time. Little concerning there. The third thing is, you'll be okay in Colorado, but in another state where what Tanya just described was front loading your billing process. And frankly, you know, you can't. You know, it's a way of charging for doing something, but pretending and trying to hide that you're charging for doing something. So you'll be all right in Colorado, but use care in other states. You know, the loopholes aren't as loopy as you think, as a matter of fact, because we're actually a little bit in the crosshairs of the funeral industry. And frankly, some of the hospice entities aren't too thrilled either. Hospices are highly dependent on the funeral industry for donations. And it might explain why, if you've ever tried to bring a training into a hospice, it's a little hard to get in the door sometimes. And it's because the funeral industry has spent years developing relationships with their local hospices so that they get the call. When a family says, I don't know, the hospice nurse, we have a group we always call, let me call them. So sometimes, a hospice will sniff you out if you're up to something. A funeral home might sniff you out if you're up to something.
Okay.
But you're lucky in Colorado. You used to be really lucky. They just changed it a little bit, and I think it was 2009. Before that, it was the Wild West, man. You had no limits on. You could have called yourself a funeral director, toot toot, had 2 little pistols and gone around and made all the funerals you wanted.
Thank you for your time.
Sure, dear.
Thanks, Tanya. So Dan, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of address what Terry was just talking about. As I mentioned, we kind of refer to ourselves as the anti-funeral home here. But first point I'd like to make is I think that for the National Funeral Home Alliance to really succeed, we need to reach across the table to the funeral industry. And I'll nominate myself as the funeral industry representative to your board if you'd like it, because I'm hoping that at some point we can stop treating the funeral industry like they're what we're against. You know, it's us versus the funeral industry. I'm a funeral home that is embracing home funerals, okay? And to Terry's other point, my biggest source of referrals is the hospice industry. So what I've done is, in order to be proactive, I go out and I do in-service trainings for hospice services by telling them, you've got staff out there that are giving families incorrect information, like that hospice nurse who called and said, they're not allowed to keep the body at home, are they? You know, so they let me in. They love when I come over and do in-service trainings for them. And as a result, about 90% of our cases come as a direct referral from hospice organizations. So I think we're proof that we can, instead of fighting this giant monster called the funeral industry, we can start changing attitudes as well. And hopefully there'll be more people like me and Caitlin, who's just down the road from me a little ways, you know, that are funeral directors, but are very home funeral friendly.
It's so good to know you're out there, Dan, and there are more and more of you. We are in touch with more and more funeral directors, I think, that are walking that line. So it's really good to know thanks for being here. And
unfortunately, there just seems to be so much verbiage that we spend time saying we're against the funeral industry and, you know, that kind of stuff. And I hope that we can change that message because, you know, like in Caitlin's videos, she always talks about the old white guy network. And when I first met her, I said, I'm one of those old white guys that's on your side. So same thing with the Home Funeral Alliance. Just because I'm a funeral home doesn't mean I'm against home funerals. I had a lot of success. I just wrote an article that came out in the newspaper here about home funerals. And now I get recognized on the street. People are like, you're that guy that wrote the article, and thank you for that. And it's a lot of people are wanting to be accepting out there, including the funeral industry. Some of them. So rather than saying that they're all bad, let's identify as the ones that are on the side of home funerals.
Yep, we hear you. Okay, so we could be wrapping up right close to on time. I've got a few things left that we need to just cover. Is there anybody else? No, looking for hands up. Doesn't look like we have any. No questions in the queue. What do you think, Terry? Should we wind down? Any closing comments from you?
Well, only that the other name for the home funeral, and the name that is a little more descriptive, is the family-directed funeral. And that's a term that you'll probably hear more frequently as it's more descriptive. It makes the point that it isn't necessary to bring in any external entity, you know, whether it's a home funeral guide or a licensed individual. It helps bring the point home that there isn't anything about the process that one can't maintain independence around. And for some people, that's the absolute point. Very few people are driven to the cause for, say, financial reasons, you know. And when, you know, you could do a home funeral for, you know, especially if you do direct cremation, you know, you'll have $40 worth of supplies and then your direct cremation. So recognize that the term family directed is another term that you're going to hear. And I think some of the thoughts to hold going forward is the matters of the death doulas. And are the death doulas going to pick up the home funeral work? They're really ideally suited to do so because they're present in the home just before death. They also have a special relationship to work out with hospice because hospice has some many years, right, at the bedside. So the doula's world has to kind of figure out where they and hospice complement each other. And my expectation is that we'll see a big rise in the NHFA membership as the doula movement also grows and expands. And this has been just wonderful tonight. Thanks so much, everybody. And I hope everyone's also aware of the fantastic Facebook page that has been set up for member dialogue. Instead of just NHFA doing the speaking, you know, everybody's reaching out. I hope everybody's found that. It's just fantastic. And remember, we are an organization that runs on donations, and there are 3 more nights of super duper events like this. Oh, and if I may, this is the book that I drew from tonight. Even if you already have it, you know what? Crack it open. You'll find some of the terrific forms, the dialogue, some of the legalese that has to be in your GPL, and your CPL is in there.
Terry, can you just say the title of that for those that are on the phone and can't see it?
Oh, of course. Thank you for pointing that out. Essentials for Practicing Home Funeral Guides. There are a number of books. All titles can be observed on the NHFA website, and then the purchase can be made, I think, there or definitely through Amazon. Tonight was the Essentials for Practicing Home Funeral Guides, right? Essentials. And indeed, that's what it contains.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes. We're so glad that everybody was here tonight. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you learned a few things. Before you go, I'll just echo Terry one more time. We are an organization that depends on donations from members. Most membership organizations do have a fee, and we don't have that. You know, we're providing this service for free, these nights of education, with the hopes that you'll think about donating if you haven't already. If each member gave just a donation, we could easily cover the costs of operating our organization. We've got some exciting things coming up in development, including a podcast that we hope to unveil in the coming year, hopefully earlier than that. We have our biennial conference that's coming up next October that's just west of Minneapolis. We just had our board retreat there, and I'm really excited about the beautiful place and the beautiful people of Minnesota that are helping us get that organized. And then also a member portal discussion and discussion group, I think separate from the Facebook group that Terry mentioned. And if you want to find that the Facebook discussion group, it's Home Home Funerals Discussions Group. If you search that in Facebook, you'll find it if you haven't already. There's already over 200 people in there and some great conversations that are coming about. Our goal for this fundraising event is $12,000. We're trying to raise that in this month's time. That will cover our costs for this coming year. You can donate through the webpage or through our Facebook page. And tonight we do have a special incentive. Terry was talking about the book. The kind of a suite of books are going to be made available as kind of a raffle item for anybody who donates in November. So we'll take everybody, no matter the amount of your donation, and put your name in a hat and pull it out. And you will receive a full set of our books: The Undertaken with Love, Essentials for Practicing Home Funeral Guides, Building Bridges Along the Death Care Continuum, and then the Planning Guide and Workbook for Home Funeral Families. So you'll get those. I think actually we're going to send you the Restoring Families Right to Choose as well. So 5 books that we'll send to you if you donate in the month of November. It enters you into that drawing. Let's see, what else? I think that's it. Just a reminder that this has been recorded tonight. It will be available at some point. We'll let you know about that. And on behalf of our entire board, thank you so much for joining us. We're so glad you're here, and the NHFA exists because of you, our members. And we just hope that you have a great evening and a great week, and maybe we'll see you on one of our other nights this week.